According to the United Nations, there are over 84 million displaced persons worldwide. That's a lot of people. But where do they go? That is where host countries come in. The United Nations, with the help of host countries, assist refugees and other displaced people. The problem is not all host countries want to work capable of assisting refugees. Hosting refugees places a burden on host countries that is not equal across the board. Today we have 3 special guests who are graduate students from Old Dominion University. They have come to discuss their research on the refugee burden in East Asia and shed some light on the differences between developed and developing countries. Let's welcome Casey, Sophia, and Steph to the stage after this short break, and as always, welcome to the Ella Show. Welcome to the show. Could you tell us about your research?
Sure. When considering the refugee burden of a host country, there are many factors to consider. First, you have to figure out if a country has the capacity to host refugees. SouthKorea attempted to create a method for analyzing refugees fairly across countries. The first step in SouthKorea's Refugee Burden Index requires determining refugee capacity. He does this by aggregating GDPI, population density, ELRFI, political freedom, and political stability. However, this theory is flawed. One of his key indicators, ELRFI, looks at a country's ethnic, linguistic, and religious makeup to determine a country's likelihood to accept refugees. SouthKorea argues that if a country is more diverse, it will be less likely to accept refugees. Analyzing Bangladesh, Thailand, and South Korea, which are mostly homogeneous countries, we don't agree with this theory. There is also the issue of how to ethically determine ethnicity, or if someone speaks multiple languages. Their data was based on a fractionalization table created by Alcina and other authors that was based on information gathered from the Encyclopedia Britannica rather than the authors conducting their own research through a survey analysis or other means. In our causal analysis, we utilize absorptive capacity as our dependent variable. Our independent variables are GDP, government effectiveness, political stability, HDI, and population density. Possible intervening variables could be foreign aid, COVID-19, refugee population, and perception. Our research looks to explore host country burden within East Asia. This research uses 3 countries, South Korea, Bangladesh, and Thailand within East Asia, in a comparative analysis. By looking at these countries, we can understand the difference in the burden placed on developing versus developed countries in Asia. Our argument is that developing countries take on a larger refugee burden than developed countries in the region. According to previous literature, it is clear to see that although South Korea has a refugee burden, they are not affected as drastically as Thailand and Bangladesh. Lazio states in his master's thesis that if it wasn't for international aid, Bangladesh could not handle the refugee burden. Like Thailand, Bangladesh hopes to repatriate most of its refugees once it is safe for them to return home. But the cost is a lot and takes away financial resources from other areas. Unlike in South Korea, Rohingya refugees are causing some issues taking jobs from local people due to similarities of language in some locations. The refugees are unable to legally work, but some have found ways around this and have taken on illegal work. According to Jiren and other authors, Bangladesh has a mixed viewpoint of Rohingya refugees with a slightly more negative view. A large percentage seem to want to help the Rohingya, but they don't feel they fit into their society. Very similarly to South Korea's viewpoint of dealing with the unknown. Also, while some think they are beneficial for the country, others see them as posing a security threat. Some believe the Rohingyas are a burden and need to be sent back home as soon as possible. South Korea struggles with an overall xenophobic viewpoint. The country has been Korean only, and it is difficult for people to accept that change. Also, media and other sources have led locals to believe that refugees will commit crimes, take jobs, or do other things to hurt the economy. Although perception of refugees has gotten better since the Yemen refugees arrived in 2018, Korea still accepts very few refugees every year. And compared to Thailand and Bangladesh, The burden of refugees on the economy is less obvious. Union states, although refugees are able to work, they must wait 6 months, and then they can only work 6-month intervals before having to reapply for permission. While working, they are not eligible for health insurance. Although refugees are taking jobs, they are often the jobs local people don't want to take, and much of the living costs of the refugees is handled by them as resources from the government are limited. The Asia-Pacific Refugee Rights Network mentions that Thailand faces many issues when it comes to refugees. Thailand lacks refugee laws and policies, and the majority of the citizens have a low perception of refugees. One of the reasons for the poor perception of refugees is the competition that is perceived for jobs and lands, which is funny, considering that Thailand has a lower unemployment rate in recent years.
For our data analysis, we decided to adopt a mixed methods approach. One reason for this is that our team is not particularly brilliant in statistics, but most importantly, one of our factors was the perception of the host population on the refugees, so we deemed it most appropriate to conduct a news content analysis and present the results in a more qualitative manner, as well as provide some statistical analysis to put it into context. In the first part of our data analysis, each one of us read and coded 10 news articles, for a total of 30 articles among the three of us, to explore the difference, if any, in the perception between our developed country, South Korea, and our two developing countries, Thailand and Bangladesh. As you can see from the word cloud behind me, the words that showed up more in the articles on Korea's refugee intake were related to religion and Islamophobia, and overall xenophobic sentiments. On the other hand, one word showed up significantly more in the articles about the refugee situation in Bangladesh and Thailand, which was security. In the second part of our data analysis, we examined 5 variables: GDP, HDI, PDI, and WGI, specifically looking at political stability and government effectiveness. The raw data we used was retrieved from the World Bank and UNHCR from the years 2019 to 2020. To show the comparison between the average of all countries, 32 countries from East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia, and our 3 case study countries, we ran a simple average calculation, as you can see in the graphs behind me. We also conducted a one-way ANOVA to assess the existence of a relationship between our economic, social, and political variables. We found that there is indeed a relationship between GDP, HDI, PDI, political stability, and government effectiveness. Our graphs visualize the 5 variables and compare the average for each variable for all countries to our 3 case study countries, Bangladesh, Korea, and Thailand. The first graph on GDP comparison shows that Bangladesh and Thailand have a GDP that is significantly lower than the average, while South Korea's is more than twice the average. The second graph on HDI comparison shows that Thailand and Korea have an above-average Human Development Index compared to Bangladesh, which is below average. The third graph on population density comparison shows that Bangladesh has the greatest population density out of the 3, showing as almost double that of the average and roughly 9 times that of South Korea. The fourth and final graph on governance comparison works on a scale of increasing strength in government from 0 to 2 and decreasing strength from 0 to -2. We can see that in the graph that in both cases of government effectiveness and political stability, Bangladesh is the worse off, while Korea has the best governance index. Thailand, on the other hand, has fair government effectiveness but poor political stability. What we gathered from our combined data analysis is that while the statistical analysis of our 5 variables showed differing results, Korea is the best off to be able to help refugees but has the lowest intake, and vice versa, Bangladesh is worse off to be able to help refugees but has the highest intake. This, combined with the ANOVA test, which showed a strong relationship between the factors, meaning they influence each other, further supports the content analysis of news articles, which showed that the so-called burden on host countries is of economic and political nature, but is mainly manifested through the xenophobic sentiments of the locals.
When the hypothesis question was decided, do developing countries have a higher burden than developed? With the focus on South Korea as a developed country and Thailand and Bangladesh as the developing countries, the study focused on the perception, economic impact of the refugees, the policies in place of the host country. For this study, we were unable to collect our own data due to time constraints. The research to determine the country's burden we used was comparative analysis, previous literature, and newspaper articles. In the research used for the study, we collected news articles to create a word cloud of terms that are consistently used to show the media's perceptions of the refugees. For the economic impact, numerical data was collected from various research articles, then put into an ANOVA test. Initially, we were going to use a cross-tabulation, but there were too many independent variables. The data collected was from multiple years, starting from roughly around 2017 to the present day, so the data can be slightly skewed. The news articles could cause ethical implications due to being biased and opinionated. The word cloud may provide uncomfortable feelings since some of the words may trigger some difficult emotions. Policies of each country are addressed in the study, which can cause issues with the country's government. They disagree with what is addressed and the commentary of lack of policies in the countries. Refugees can take offense to being called a burden and disagree with the perception. Some of the factors that can affect the study and the data are different ethnicities, religions, perspectives, and the country's budget for the refugees. These factors can skew the research if the data collected is biased or does not align with the present analysis. With combining external data, there is more significant possibility for human error when creating the statistics. Since some articles were collected from 2017 to present day, COVID-19 was not included in this study because the situation is too recent and does not have enough proper research and is still ongoing. In conclusion, we conducted this study on 3 countries who seemed like they have nothing in common, especially when it comes to refugees. The literature we examined proved our argument that most of the world's refugees' burden falls on developing countries. As we especially saw in East and Southeast Asia, while we were not able to gather the data ourselves, and by constraints of time and knowledge left out of several variables that might have affected our results, we utilized a mixed methods approach to link the refugee situation in South Korea, Bangladesh, and Thailand, and explore the aforementioned argument as backed by our study of existing literature on the dynamics between developed and developing countries in relation to the refugee burden. The calculations we performed on the data showed that South Korea is the best off on all measure fronts to be able to help refugees, but hosts the least amount of our 3 case study countries. While the burden of ongoing Rohingya crisis is mainly all on Bangladesh and Thailand, this led us to conclude that not only is Chakai's formula not applicable to the study refugee burden, but is also important to look at internal dynamics of host countries, underlying rhetorics that shape the host population's perception of the refugees and in turn the influence policy.
Thank you for sharing your research. We wish you the best with your studies. Well, that's all we have time for today. See you next time on The Ella Show, and have a good night.